Good morning. I'm Fred Bonato, the Provost of St. Peter's University. On behalf of President Dr. Eugene Kranaki, it is my pleasure to welcome you to St. Peter's of assessing emergency preparedness for underserved populations. Here at St. Peter's University, our students and staff are also committed to the health and well-being of underserved populations. Since its inception 5 years ago, our campus kitchen has served over 60,000 meals to our homebound, homeless, or hungry neighbors in Hudson County. In fact, we are the only university in the country to provide a trifecta of services to the community, including a campus kitchen, food pantry, and clothes closet. Each year, our students volunteer hundreds of hours, 6 days a week, to make these programs possible. In addition to being committed to serving our community, we're also committed to the success of our students. In 2018, St. Peter's University was the recipient of the American Council on Education Fidelity Investments Award for Institutional Transformation. We also ranked 8th in the nation among private colleges for highest mobility rate for improving economic status. Through programs like the Guarini Institute for Government and Leadership and the Center for Leadership Studies, we are training the next generation of policymakers, elected officials, informed citizens, and business and civic leaders to excel intellectually, serve compassionately, and lead ethically. And job placement is something that we take pride in. 94% of the class of 2018 was either employed or in graduate school within 6 months of graduation. I would like to extend a special welcome to Subcommittee Chairman Congressman Donald Payne, who knows firsthand the value of a St. Peter's University education, as he's the proud father of 2 of our students. It is truly an honor to have you with us on campus. Thank you for choosing St. Peter's University as the place for this important discussion. We wish you a most productive day. Thank you.
The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery will come to order. The Subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on protecting every citizen, assessing emergency preparedness for underserved populations. Good morning. We're here today to discuss how underserved populations are treated in emergencies. I'm particularly pleased to be back home for this hearing, and I want to thank St. Peter's University for hosting us. I appreciate my friend and colleague from New Jersey, Congressman Bill Pascrell, for joining me. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Each of you bring a unique and insightful perspective to this topic based on the great work that you've been doing. Unfortunately, FEMA chose not to attend this hearing as it has subsequent hearings to directly hear from them directly from those who have been working on the ground to make disaster response more equitable. Working through a partnership between local, state, and federal officials, as well as local community groups, everyone does what they can to help their fellow citizens recover. Still, not all citizens have the same needs during or after a disaster, and a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. Certain Americans, such as children, low-income individuals, or those with access and functional needs, may require special attention in the planning of response and recovery phases of disasters. For instance, children are more likely to experience mental health distress, including showing signs of PTSD after a disaster, than adults. Those with access and functional needs may need some type of durable medical equipment in the midst of immediately following a disaster. Low-income individuals may not have the resources to evacuate before a storm or may not have the resources or knowledge to navigate the confusing maze of federal disaster assistance programs after a disaster. The response gaps that exist today result in real consequences for those on the ground. George Washington University researchers found that of 2,975 people who died in Puerto Rico as a result of Hurricane Maria, the clear majority were those living in poverty and senior citizens, many of whom were likely people with disabilities who faced deadly mobility barriers to safety. After Sandy, children living in homes with minor damage were over four times likely to be sad or depressed, and over twice as likely to have problems sleeping since the storm as were children from homes with no damage. The impact of children after Hurricane Sandy is one of the reasons I have introduced the Homeland Security for Children's Act, which would require the Department of Homeland Security to incorporate the needs of children into its emergency preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation activities. Unless we do more to address and account for the needs of the disproportionately impacted populations in our emergency planning, people will continue to suffer. The witnesses gathered here today will discuss the work that they have done to close the response gaps that lead to desperate outcomes. Through the discussion today, I am hopeful we can learn from each other's efforts and identify ways that coordination with the federal government can be improved for the next disaster. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. With that, I now recognize my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquarello.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to join you on this important field hearing. As you know, as a long-time member of the original Homeland Security Committee, when it was formed right after 9/11, and it's an honor to be part of today's hearing. I see that our state police are well represented here as we worked with them back then. Probably the best, or at least one of the best in the entire country. I don't say that by blowing smoke, I mean it, having worked with them. And I'm very impressed with their central communication. As you know, that was one of the major problems during 9/11, and that is people couldn't communicate with one another. Many departments, whether it be police or fire, and that was a major step. I think we've come a long way since then in terms of communication, because you can't communicate, you really are going to not be what you need to be for the general public. So it's critical that we ensure that everyone is safe before, during, and after an emergency. We usually think about responding to the public and the community after a tragedy happens. So we're better planning now, doing better planning, thanks to the work that you've done on Homeland Security, Mr. Chairman. We want to know who the vulnerable populations are, like the elderly, like children, people with disabilities. They already receive inequitable treatment in our society many times. Underserved, low-income populations need our help too. Our disaster recovery efforts should not exacerbate this issue. Transit plans are important prior to an emergency. Many communities do not have emergency evacuations, whether it's a man-made or nature-made disaster. They already receive inequitable retreatment. Again, but transit plans are important prior to an emergency. After 9/11, buses and the New York MTA and the New Jersey Transit shuttle people out and equipment in to support first responders. The best laid plans do not always work, though. A transit plan could have helped an estimated 100,000, 200,000 vulnerable people after Hurricane Katrina, who lacked access to a private vehicle. But few transit drivers reported to work, and folks were unprotected. In 2008, the Transportation Research Board finalized their report, which I authorized at that time in the 2005 Federal Highway Bill, analyzing the role of transit in emergency evacuations. This report notes the importance of having a plan at all levels of government that includes transit, especially for our vulnerable populations. The report also calls for funding critical infrastructure, which we still have not done when it comes to the Hudson Tunnel and Gateway projects. Eisenhower started the building anyway of the interstate highway system in this country. And the main reason he did it was because of safety of the population, and because we had vulnerable folks, but the country was vulnerable. Everybody was vulnerable. We cannot leave anybody behind. We must have a plan. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We're good at going after something after it occurs. We're still practicing on preparing and preventing these things from happening. So I'm honored to be on your panel. I'm anxious to hear the panel, and we'll get to their question, and I have a couple questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pasquarello. I welcome our first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Major Lou Bukhari, who is the commanding officer of the Emergency Management Section within the New Jersey State Police. This is Major Bukhari's second time before this subcommittee, and I thank him for coming. Next, Ms. Kelly Boyd is the Access and Functional Needs Planner for New Jersey's Office of Emergency Management. We have Ms. Elizabeth Kurda is the Director for Government Accountability Office's Education, Workforce, and Income Security Division. And lastly, we have Ms. Marcy Roth is the CEO of the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. Welcome all of you. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Major Bukhari.
Good morning, Chairman Payne and Congressman Pasquarello. On behalf of the State Director of Emergency Management, Colonel Patrick J. Callahan, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I am Major Louis Bukhari, Commanding Officer of the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management. I'm accompanied by Ms. Kelly Boyd, who serves as NJOEM's Access and Functional Needs Planner. Ms. Boyd and I are honored to be here today to share some of New Jersey's experiences and lessons learned in emergency management and to discuss preparedness for vulnerable populations. The New Jersey emergency management community is committed to providing fair and equitable emergency management resources to our residents and minimizing barriers to obtaining services. We do this by including individuals with disabilities and others with access and functional needs, advocacy groups, organizations, community groups, and faith-based organizations in our emergency management program, providing them not only with a voice in emergency management, but a role as well. That role can extend from personal preparedness to working as an emergency manager, to volunteering, to participating on working groups and other collaborative efforts to ensure that our mutual goals are achievable. In short, we look at each person not only as someone who may need our services, but also as a person who can contribute to a more resilient and self-reliant New Jersey. New Jersey is no stranger to natural disasters. During the past 10 years, we've faced hurricanes, numerous nor'easters, winter storms, wildfires, wind events, and floods. Each of these events involved unique circumstances and required us to take a hard look at the adequacy of planning and response efforts, our collaborative networks, and impacts to individuals and communities. Most importantly, we learned about the significant challenges faced by some of our vulnerable residents, but we also learned how to incorporate their experience into the planning process to provide the services they need, not the services we think they need. Although it has been nearly 7 years since Hurricane Sandy, it remains at the forefront of discussions for continuous evaluation of response operations, improvements in planning, and building capabilities. Post-Sandy, the emergency management community recognized that we had to make substantial improvements with outreach to provide better, more efficient services to our residents and to ensure that staff and volunteers have all the tools required for an effective response. Although New Jersey is a resource-rich state, our experiences in Sandy showed the collaborative networks required for effective communications and service delivery weren't as robust as needed and didn't connect us well enough to the diverse communities we serve. Also, while many plans existed at the state and local levels, more coordinated training and exercises of those plans was required, especially regarding inclusion and participation by the DAFN population. In the aftermath of Sandy and other events that have impacted New Jersey, our emergency management community at all levels within the state has engaged in a continuous collaborative review and evaluation of response, planning, training, and exercises. We have increased focus on relationship building across all levels with the end goal of inclusive whole community engagement. This includes stakeholders across the state and local level, advocacy groups, and community and faith-based organizations that serve DAFN populations, older adults, and low-income communities. The concerns voiced by vulnerable populations go beyond issues identified during Sandy. Transportation accidents, wildfires, active shooter responses, and other events across the nation may generate unique preparedness concerns for segments of vulnerable populations that must also be addressed as a part of our planning. Collaborative planning at the state level is spearheaded through the State Emergency Management Program stakeholders, also known as SEMPS, which brings together emergency management staff from key state agencies, non-governmental organizations, community groups, federal partners, and the county offices of emergency management. This group comes together on a monthly basis. In fact, most of these emergency managers are on a first-name basis with each other, as well as the county emergency management coordinators. The relationships developed through this network provide integral support for vulnerable populations and ensure that the emergency management community at the local level is able to draw upon and connect with the necessary resources to support emergency management programs. Ms. Boyd's testimony will address some of the specifics of the excellent work being done by the state and local collaborative planning groups to enhance DAFN preparedness and inclusion in emergency management. Although New Jersey has come a long way since Sandy, we know that we have many tasks ahead of us. We are confident, however, that our emergency managers and residents are committed to a stronger, more resilient New Jersey with equal access to services for everyone. I thank you for this opportunity to testify to this subcommittee.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Ms. Boyd.
Good morning, Chairman Payne and committee members. My name is Kelly Boyd. For several years, I have had the privilege of serving as the Access and Functional Needs Planner for NJOEM. As a person with a disability and as an emergency manager, I am honored to testify today about the exciting work we are doing to enhance preparedness for the disabilities and access and functional needs DAFN community in New Jersey. I work with government agencies, advocacy groups, faith and community-based organizations, and NGOs. Through strong alliances with many organizations, including the Centers for Independent Living and the statewide Parent Advocacy Network, we strive to ensure the personal preparedness of the DAFN community and provide emergency managers with a pool of DAFN subject matter experts and resources. My testimony will cover the state's Register Ready program and give an overview of our inclusive planning initiatives. This includes state and county core advisory groups, the county AFN coordinators group, and special DAFN-related working groups. As noted, one planning tool NJOEM administers and encourages emergency managers to use is Register Ready. It is a secure database where residents and facilities can voluntarily enter DAFN-specific information so emergency managers can better plan for their needs. Its GIS mapping capabilities also allow emergency managers to identify individuals within an impacted area. Emergency managers have used the data to make reverse 911 calls, conduct wellness checks, assist with evacuations, and anticipate DFN supplies and staffing needs for shelters. Additionally, we follow FEMA's Core Advisory Group, CAG concept, for inclusive collaboration between disability stakeholders and emergency managers. We have state and county CAGs. The state CAG, known as the New Jersey Group for Access and Integration Needs in Emergencies and Disasters, NJGAIN, was established in 2006. Members from relevant state agencies and disability advocacy groups share best practices, offer training, engage in planning, and provide resources and subject matter expertise. In fact, during Sandy, members provided critical information and resources to the DFN community, including durable medical equipment and supplies. We help counties establish CAGs led by disability advocacy groups, which is now required for county EMA funding. 1/3 of our counties already have CAGs that have carried out significant projects with wide-ranging impact. For example, CAGs have developed and conducted a radiological reception center exercise and DFN overnight emergency shelter simulations for emergency managers and individuals who have DFN. We avoid role-playing by engaging members of the DFN community. Another unique CAG initiative is the DFN Active Shooter Preparedness Working Group, which recently produced a video with tips for law enforcement and the DFN community. Members also participated in a school safety summit on active shooter response planning for students with disabilities and are currently working on a tabletop exercise for dialysis centers. Several CAGs also work with the Community Emergency Response Team CERT program to host CERT classes that have recruited individuals with DAFN. CAGs also developed a comprehensive preparedness guide for vulnerable individuals and provide preparedness information to thousands of vulnerable residents and service providers at public events. I also oversee the County AFN Coordinators Group, comprised of an AFN coordinator from each county office of emergency management. The group has addressed matters such as register-ready capabilities, proposed legislation, MOUs for medical equipment and supplies, and DFN-related training. We also partner with FEMA on special projects, such as the region's Disability Resource Database and the New Jersey Mapping Project for Vulnerable Populations. The CAGs and County AFN Coordinators Group identify gaps in training and then develop and deliver training to members of the emergency management and DFN communities. Examples include a new CERT module focused on responding to DFN community needs, personal care assistance training for shelter workers, autism awareness training for responders and preparedness tips for family members, and emergency preparedness training for those who are visually impaired. Additionally, we ensure exercises at all levels include DFN consideration and involvement. Recent exercises and drills included air and rail incidents, hurricanes, and nuclear and radiological incidents. Finally, we established working groups to address specific gaps. One example is the State Sheltering Task Force, a multi-agency planning team that examined capabilities and gaps in sheltering, including issues experienced by vulnerable populations. And the task force develops training to address those issues as well as guidance. Thank you for permitting me to testify here today.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. Next, we will hear from, I now recognize Ms. Curda to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne and Representative Pascrell, thank you for inviting me to New Jersey to discuss disaster assistance for people with disabilities. I'm sure many people in this room experienced the devastation of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and its impact on people with disabilities. As you are keenly aware, in 2017, 3 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, hit Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands in rapid succession, causing widespread damage. As a result, obtaining food, water, medicine, and transportation was challenging for those affected by the hurricanes, and particularly for those with disabilities. Today, I will discuss aspects of our May 2019 report on the challenges people with disabilities faced in accessing disaster assistance following the 2017 hurricanes. I will also discuss how effectively FEMA has implemented changes in how it supports people with disabilities. Regarding the challenges, substantial damage from the hurricanes made it more difficult for some people with disabilities to access life-sustaining provisions such as oxygen. This was particularly true in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where supplies in central locations could not be delivered to remote areas of the islands. In addition, shelters did not always have appropriate food or accessible restrooms for people with disabilities. Aspects of FEMA's application process for assistance also created challenges. For example, in addition to long wait times of up to an hour and a half on FEMA's helpline, FEMA's registration process did not give people a clear opportunity to state that they have a disability or to request an accommodation. FEMA needs this information so it can offer appropriate accommodations or other assistance to survivors. As a result, it may have been more difficult or even impossible for some people with disabilities to get the help that they needed. In addition, even for those who disclosed their disability-related needs, FEMA did not have a systematic way to highlight and share that information with staff tasked with providing assistance across its various programs. In our May report, we recommended that FEMA develop new registration questions to better identify survivors' disability-related needs. FEMA agreed and has already changed the registration questions. Since the change, FEMA told us that more people have been reporting their disability-related needs following recent disasters. We also recommended that FEMA develop a way to systematically alert FEMA staff working with survivors who have reported a disability-related need. FEMA disagreed with this recommendation because it said it lacked the funding to change its information systems in the near term and will not be able to do so until it completes a long-term system modernization in 2024. However, we believe that in the interim, FEMA could identify workarounds, such as encouraging staff working directly with survivors to review case file notes. Following the 2017 hurricanes, FEMA launched a new approach to how it responds to and assists people with disabilities. But FEMA's implementation of this new approach had limitations. For example, FEMA significantly reduced the number of disability integration staff deployed to disasters and changed their role from directly assisting people with disabilities to advising joint field office managers on how to do this. Instead of deploying staff specialists to provide assistance, all generalist staff deployed to help respond to and recover from a disaster were to receive training on disability issues and provide hands-on assistance where needed. However, FEMA has not yet provided comprehensive training to all deployable staff on how to help people with disabilities. We recommended that FEMA develop a plan for delivering training to FEMA staff that promotes competency and disability awareness. FEMA agreed, but is pursuing a somewhat different approach. We will monitor FEMA's efforts to ensure that it has clear plans in place for developing this training. Finally, in 2017, FEMA stopped offering comprehensive training to non-federal partners on how to incorporate the needs of people with disabilities in emergency planning. FEMA stated it planned to improve the course, but had no timeline for doing so. We recommended FEMA develop timelines for developing the new course, and FEMA agreed. FEMA has stated that the new course will be ready for the 2020 hurricane season. In conclusion, FEMA has taken a number of steps to improve how FEMA supports individuals with disabilities following a disaster. However, we continue to believe that changing its approach to disability integration before staff have been fully trained may leave FEMA staff ill-prepared to identify and address the challenges that individuals with disabilities face while recovering from a disaster. We will continue to monitor FEMA's actions as it makes additional progress toward addressing our recommendations. This concludes my prepared statement, and I'll be happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you, Ms. Curtin. And now I recognize Ms. Ross to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Payne, Congressman Pascrell, my fellow panelists. I'm honored to appear before you today. My name is Marcy Roth, and I am the CEO of the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, a national and global coalition of disability rights, emergency management, public health, and community leaders committed to equal access and whole community inclusion before, during, and after disasters. I was appointed by President Obama and served as Senior Advisor to FEMA Administrator Fugate for almost 8 years. My role included serving as the congressionally mandated Disability Coordinator, responsible for ensuring FEMA meets all of its disability-related obligations established in the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006. I was also charged with establishing and directing FEMA's Office of Disability Integration and Coordination from 2010 until my departure in 2017. I'm here today to report that despite an investment of over $34 billion in emergency preparedness funding in the past 15 years, our communities remain unprepared for disasters, and the people most disproportionately impacted are people with disabilities, older adults, and others with access and functional needs. Many of these members of every community in the country have legal protection in disasters, but these protections are not monitored and enforced, placing these individuals and their communities in harm's way every time there is a disaster. It is important to note that there have been over 120 major disasters in the past 3 years. The disproportionate impact of disasters on people with disabilities, older adults, and others who also have access and functional needs is not insignificant. In fact, people with disabilities and older adults are 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be injured in a disaster. This is due to a lack of planning, accessibility, and accommodation. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 1 in 4 adults, 26% of the population, has 1 or more disabilities, 15% of the population is over age 65 and growing. Interruption of medical care and disability services were the primary cause of almost 3,000 deaths following Hurricane Maria. 71% of deaths in Hurricane Katrina were people over the age of 60, 50% of the deaths in Superstorm Sandy, and 77% of people who died in the California wildfires this past year were over the age of 65, and many had disabilities. Equal access to disaster services has been promised to children and adults with disabilities since passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, 46 years ago. There are no waivers to civil rights protections during a disaster. In addition to the obligations that come with the expenditure of every federal dollar before, during, and after disasters, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 prohibits recipients from discriminating on the basis of disability in the operation of public entities, transportation systems, public accommodations, and the 1999 Olmstead Supreme Court decision assured that people with disabilities would be served in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs, including in disasters. Despite this, there has been no action taken to address the partnership's formal and informal requests to the federal agencies responsible for enforcement to prevent civil rights violations in disasters, and as recently as last week, a waiver of civil rights was issued by the Department of Health and Human Services to Louisiana, allowing nursing home placement of disaster-impacted people. Key to compliance is FEMA's congressionally mandated disability coordinator, implementing responsibilities as defined in the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. These responsibilities include ensuring that the needs of individuals with disabilities are being properly addressed in emergency preparedness and disaster relief, consulting with organizations that represent the interests and rights of individuals with disabilities, ensuring the development of training materials and a curriculum for training emergency response providers, state, local, and tribal government officials, and others, and ensuring the availability of accessible transportation options in evacuation. The partnership and our member organizations have continually attempted to consult with the FEMA Disability Coordinator without success. We are the nation's organizations that represent the interests and rights of individuals with disabilities before, during, and after disasters. The Disability Coordinator has also prevented the FEMA Individual Assistance Directorate from collaborating with us, and it wasn't until Senator Casey reached out to FEMA that we were granted an invitation to meet with FEMA senior leadership. This meeting, requested by one of our community leaders, has not yet been scheduled. It must be noted that the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties meets with us regularly, but even they have been unable to get FEMA's Disability Coordinator to the table with us. Since 2018, disaster-impacted communities report a lack of FEMA-qualified disability integration representatives. Most of the trained and qualified disability experts have left the agency. Over a year ago, we were told that by the disability coordinator that FEMA would be hiring disability integration specialists and training the entire agency to ensure qualified disability integration experts would be ensuring the rights of disaster-impacted people with disabilities and their protection. However, it appears that only one has been hired, existing training has been discontinued, and at least one key position remains unfilled
Please wrap
after
it
an
up.
18-month
Please wrap up, please.
vacancy. After the GAO report that was recently discussed, two bipartisan bills were introduced, led by Senators Casey and Collins, Congressman and woman Langevin, Smith, Shalala, and Gonzalez-Colon, to address the urgent needs to protect every citizen, meeting the federal government's obligations. The Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act and the Disaster Relief Medicaid Act will work together to provide solutions for the whole community. We call on Congress and the President to quickly pass and enact these bills into law before the next disaster strikes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay. The chair now, in the interest of time, the gentleman from New Jersey, the chair will defer and recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquarello, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that courtesy, and it feels good to be at St. Peter's Jesuit institution, having gone to Fordham myself across the river. This is a good place to learn, and this is a good place to have a hearing like this. They go together very nicely. I'm very, very concerned and have been, particularly the last few years, Ms. Curta, of FEMA. On the Ways and Means Committee, we look at these budgets very, very carefully and what they ask for. You're the spokesman for FEMA today. I'm not here to beat up on FEMA. But the GAO did a report very specific to what you talk about, what you did talk about, in a very reasonable way, I thought. What I'm concerned is we see a pattern here. I see a pattern. And I want to ask you a very simple question in the beginning. Does FEMA have the resources that can address the very problems we're talking about today? Because the GAO has some questions about that.
Yeah, we did not analyze whether they have an appropriate amount of resources. However, they do have a large deployable staff of people that can be sent out following hurricanes and disasters, and they have this sort of new vision, which involves training all of staff to have disability competency and to be able to help people following disasters. However, they haven't established training for those people yet, and so it's a little unclear to us how those deployed resources are going to be put to effective use.
Well, we need people to do the very thing we're talking about here today. If you don't have the people, you don't have the resources. And there are so many vacancies that have not been filled. It reminds me of the rest of the administration. So I know in a dictatorship, you have very few people to worry about in the administration because there's only one person making all the decisions. We're a democracy, so we need input. And you've heard from each of the people here today. In fact, I go to Major Bashiri in his statement, which says it all. Most importantly, he wrote and presented to us. We learned about the significant challenges faced by some of our more vulnerable residents, but we also learned how to incorporate their experience, their expertise into the planning process. I think that's a profound statement. After my many years in the Congress, I didn't see too many profound statements. So in other words, you're going to the very people who have the problems, maybe, which we all do, by the way, but we're talking about particular problems here, and we're asking them in our planning to protect them and provide safety. What do you think? What should be done? What didn't you have? I don't see that in FEMA. Maybe I can be enlightened. Or maybe we should be listening to these people here and be enlightened, hopefully. Because that GAO report is not a good one. You know which one I'm talking about. You don't accept that as the end product. In other words, we can rest on whatever laurels we have. You don't believe that, do you?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
You don't rest on the laurels of what's happened. You see the problems just as the GAO made a report about FEMA.
Yes.
And we've had more hurricanes. We've had more natural disasters. And it seems to me, I see very little improvement in FEMA, to be very honest with you. And I fought for every dollar for FEMA, because I think it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But if the administration, whatever that administration may be, and whenever it does exist, if they're not cooperating with us, if they're not cooperating with you and the folks that are here, what the heck, what are we doing? We're massaging each other. We're talking about serious business here, Mr. Chairman. And this hearing today,
Recognize the gentleman for another 3 minutes.
this problem today that we see is not gonna go away. So, the Disability Integration and Coordination Office, can you recount how our special needs populations informed about transportation and shelter resources in an emergency evacuation?
The responsibility for the first response following a disaster rests primarily with state and local responders, such as the folks at the table.
I'm sorry?
The responsibility for initial response following a hurricane rests primarily with the state and local providers, such as those here at the
Then I'll ask
table.
the major then, because you do have some responsibility according to the mission of FEMA. Let me ask the major that same question.
So one of the main ways that we connect with the DAFN population is through technology. And we have, NJ Transit has a link right to our Register Ready platform, and we can help provide, access points, transportation, et cetera, for the vulnerable populations in an evacuation.
Do you communicate with FEMA?
Yes.
Are they cooperative?
Yes.
Let me ask the next question. What would you suggest to help what we're talking about today, to facilitate what we want to do? What the chairman is anxious to do and has been working on day in and day out, because he is an official member of Homeland Security. I'm not there anymore. What would you suggest?
Certainly any resources by way of, financial help that we can get would be beneficial. When you talk about FEMA staff being trained in a wide variety of areas as opposed to subject matter expertise in dealing with these vulnerable populations, you're asking a lot of that staff person in a disaster. In addition to that, FEMA has historically been very good at sending surge staff in after a disaster and staying on board for a period of time. But what we see is that FEMA is very transient. And they come, they help for a while, and then they move on to the next disaster. And with that movement causes an various interpretations and rules, policy. It creates hurdles at the state, county, and local levels. So we'd like, not only additional training for FEMA staff on subject matter expertise to help these populations, but embedded personnel to stay with the states and territories through a disaster to have consistency interpretation of
We've
policy.
had, under Republican and Democratic administrations, very excellent directors for the most part. We had some problems back at Katrina, but that's yesterday. This is today. I've asked on my own, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude with this, 20 congressmen at random, Democrats and Republicans, only one was able to even tell me who the head of FEMA is now. I yield. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello. That's a tough question. I might have to think about that myself, who the head of FEMA is these days. But I'd like to thank the gentleman for his questions. I'll now move on to questions myself, recognize myself. Ms. Curta, in 2017 storms, FEMA sent an average of 55 disability integration advisors to help with the response and recovery after the disaster. Now they start with an average of 5, whose leadership, who advise the leadership rather than go out into the field. Can you describe FEMA's rationale for this change, this drastic, dramatic change?
All I can say is that what they have articulated to us is their view that rather than having specialized people in the field, they believe that they can serve more people if they have trained everybody, all deployable staff and all program staff, in disability competency. That is what they have told us is their vision for this change.
But I mean, going from 55 to 5 seems dramatic at best, drastic. Such a change. I mean, how are you able to sustain the same type of support with that dramatic a change in staffing?
It is still unclear to us how effective that will be. We looked at the 2017 hurricanes and the response, and we did identify a lot of problems with the response and made 7 recommendations to FEMA to improve how they do this. So we have not yet evaluated how this new model is working.
One, I would urge you to definitely try to focus on that and come up with some type of response to that, please. Ms. Roth, any comment you'd like to make with respect to this?
One of FEMA's biggest challenges began to be addressed a number of years ago by developing a qualification system to ensure that the folks who were being deployed by the federal government had the qualifications necessary to meet certain responsibilities. One of the federal government's primary responsibilities is to make sure that every federal dollar that is either spent by the federal government or given to others to spend it complies with civil rights obligations. The responsibility that FEMA has is to make sure that qualified people are doing what's necessary to make sure that the protections of people with disabilities are assured throughout disasters. It is very difficult to understand how a generalized workforce who doesn't have qualifications in the very things that FEMA set out to develop qualifications for could possibly meet those obligations. And we're talking about investments of billions of dollars, that every dollar must comply with those obligations, and yet unqualified people are now dealing with life and death, life-saving, life-sustaining, and the futures of 26% of the population, people with disabilities.
And every dollar, well, good luck with that. Major Bucari, we've heard reports that the process to apply for FEMA aid is confusing and cumbersome and creates unnecessary hurdles for low-income individuals. Many simply give up before making it through the entire process. after Sandy, did you hear from survivors that the process to apply for housing assistance was too onerous? And how would you recommend simplifying that process?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I certainly would say it's onerous, it's cumbersome. In dealing with it at the state level, as an example, we're dealing with IT issues right now and FEMA rolling out new IT programs that aren't compatible with our own. So we're doing twice the work. So now imagine you're in a disaster, you've lost everything, and now you're trying to navigate a system and you're a low-income individual. So it's very tough. One of the things that we'd like to see FEMA take a look at in general is the individual assistance award amount. When you're talking about an individual assistance award of $34,900 with no cost of living adjustment, it's tough. Here in the Northeast, it's clearly more expensive to live here than it is in other areas of the country. We'd also like FEMA to take a look at separating out renters, the cost to rent from this award, because you have individuals that are spending every last dollar of an award on rent and don't have the necessities that they need, like simple things like food and clothing. Some of the other things that we'd like to see, we'd like FEMA to move ideally to a one-stop shopping experience. When you have multiple federal programs, you have low-income individuals, it's tough to navigate the process. We'd like to see us come to a day when an individual can come, log on, enter their personal information, and have that system tell them exactly what they're eligible for. We understand there are challenges. These people have to be able to get to a computer. They have to be able to navigate the process. We've taken steps at our level, at the state level. We have a state library initiative where we're pushing out information, working with the state library on personal preparedness, educating them on the programs that are available to our most vulnerable residents. And they, in turn, are working with the county and local libraries to be a resource for that population, where those individuals can come in, work with the library staff, and navigate that tough, onerous system. We also think that there should be an agreement in the deadlines for these programs. Quite often you have the SBA come in early on to offer loans and then are gone. And you have people that are waiting to see what aid is available to them. Do they not have insurance? Are they getting an insurance award? And then SBA has come and gone. We'd also like to see the SBA move to offer microloans to low-income individuals to just help them rapidly get back on their feet.
That's interesting. You mentioned the availability of a one-stop type situation. And so you're saying that you work with the libraries in order to provide a portal for these individuals to come, or maybe even that would be a good idea for maybe in these circumstances have FEMA set up a place where people can go to access the computer for that service.
Yes, this is a multi-pronged initiative. Certainly in the recovery phase, we would leverage that relationship with the state library, who again then connects with the county and local libraries. We work with them on everything from individual preparedness to recovery on the back end. What we're hoping is that those who may not have a computer, maybe they only have a cell phone. You can imagine navigating an application through a cell phone is not that easy. Mm-hmm. We would hope that they would make that trip to the library, right to the public library, and that connection that we're making, state, county, local, that relationship building would ultimately benefit our residents.
Thank you. The gentleman have another question he'd like to pose before his time?
No, I'm good, thank you.
You're good? Okay, let me ask Ms. Boyd. After Sandy, can you discuss the benefits in New Jersey of having FEMA's disability integration advisors on the ground assisting disaster survivors?
Sure. When Sandy hit in October of 2012, my recollection is that the Disability Integration Advisor Program was fairly new at that time. And I was in the role then as chair of NJ Gaines, and I was able to interact with a small group of disability integration advisors and specialists who assisted New Jersey by working in the field, securing durable medical equipment, and sharing information and resources. They also, for example, aided individuals and groups at senior living facilities when power was out or supplies were needed, in other high-rise buildings, and ultimately went on to work with the long-term recovery groups. One of the individuals at that time who worked with me was already familiar with a lot of the projects we had and our partners because he attended the NJ GAIN meetings and kept in contact with me as different projects arose and still does to this day. We continue to partner on various projects with both the disability integration specialist and advisor from FEMA Region 2. And they've been helpful in pulling in other staff from FEMA, including the VAL, members of FEMA FIT, and others when we have needs or questions. The one concern I had at the time was that some of the folks that were deployed were unfamiliar with the resources. So that's why I've worked very hard to maintain a close relationship with the staff that's currently working within the region. And they have partnered with me and other stakeholders to provide trainings to NJ GAIN members and other groups, especially the core advisory groups and the county AFN coordinators, and are currently working on a presentation and a toolkit to help the county agencies that are currently working on setting up CAGs better understand what that process is. And then they will work with me to provide briefings to those who are spearheading the CAGs to get them off the ground and really brainstorm about the issues that need to be addressed. I also support the hiring of, I support more funding so there's folks that can be hired at the local level to support emergency management, especially the vulnerable populations who might be affected by local emergencies, and rely on the staff that's there before FEMA can get out to assist.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Ms. Roth, as a former head of the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, what are your thoughts on FEMA's outreach to advocacy groups such as yours in the wake of a disaster? And are they effectively leveraging the help of nonprofits to improve their response?
The Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies is a coalition of virtually all of the disability organizations across the country who focus on these issues. The partnership itself is an organization that focuses exclusively on disability and disasters before, during, and after disasters. We have been trying since 2017 to continue working with FEMA's Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, and unfortunately, we have not been successful in that. We've had a couple of invitations. We've had a couple of opportunities for the disability coordinator to speak to groups, but we have had no opportunities for collaboration. In fact, on a regular basis, I hear from FEMA employees that they have been specifically told not to work with the disability organizations. This is a tremendous missed opportunity. Our members have a footprint in virtually every community in the country. We have the ability to support local organizations immediately after disasters. When disability integration advisors have worked with us until they've been told not to continue to work with us, together we have been very successful in meeting urgent and immediate needs of people who are counting on us the most to get this right.
Well, thank you. And that is very troubling to hear. For for there to be some type of discouragement in working with organizations that are on the ground, doing the work, have the information, and can be a vital resource in moving these efforts forward. It just baffles me. But what's new with this organization? Just troubling. But let me thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days without objection. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Well, we'll move to the second panel. So, I welcome our second panel of witnesses. Unfortunately, Mr. Dorian Harrell, who is the Director of the Emergency Management Homeland Security for the City of Newark, cannot be with us today. There was extensive flooding in the City of Newark last night, and he is attending to that emergency. So I think this hearing is very timely. Next, we have Mr. Luke Kopish, who is the Deputy Director for the Alliance Center of Independence. And lastly, we have Dr. Lawrence Flint, who is a representative of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics and serves on the Disaster Preparedness committee for the organization. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each of the witnesses to summarize his or her statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Kopish.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. Thank you to Chairman Payne and Congressman Pascrell for bringing attention to this important topic. My name is Luke Kopish. I'm the Deputy Director of the Alliance Center for Independence. We're located in Edison, New Jersey, and we're a Center for Independent Living. We're a 503c nonprofit organization, and we serve Union, Middlesex, and Somerset counties in New Jersey. The Alliance Center for Independence believes that emergency preparedness for people with disabilities is a civil rights issue. But we began working on emergency preparedness since 2011 during Hurricane Irene. Since then, we have trained over 700 people with disabilities on emergency preparedness and disaster, organized 2 mock shelter exercises with people with disabilities as well as emergency planners. We have presented at many conferences and conducted many trainings to emergency planners, people with disabilities, parents, and other people involved with disasters and disability. ACI first formed the core advisory group along with FEMA and has been working with emergency managers as well as FEMA, as well as New Jersey VOAD and the American Red Cross. ACI really encourages people to take responsibility for their own emergency planning. We teach individuals with disabilities how to prepare, how to communicate with emergency managers, as well as how to put emergency preparedness plans into place before a disaster hits. We also train people on preparing go bags and really the shelter in place if that's something that is an option for people. During Superstorm Sandy, we were called into action to provide assistance to people with disabilities, survivors of the storm in our catchment area. Our staff worked and called 3,000 consumers of ours and offered assistance. And the assistance ranged from financial assistance to where they go for help with FEMA, to who to call to get durable medical equipment. We also volunteer our time to help with Port Light Inclusive Disaster Strategies to operate a hotline for survivors of Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago. So we have a lot of experience. And this work that we do is extremely important because 54 million people in the United States have a disability, including 3 million children. 61% of people with disabilities have not made a plan to quickly and safely evacuate their homes. Only 24% of people with disabilities have made emergency plan preparations specific to their disability. 2.4 million people with a disability have medical equipment that require electricity. My power was out during last night, so I can see, it's still out. So I can see why this is such a huge need to get people prepared. Currently, people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely than non-disabled people to be critically or fatally injured during the disaster. These are all the reasons why our communities need to be prepared. Emergency preparation and response and recovery fall under Title II and Title III of of the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the Rehab Act of 1973. To quote Paul Timmons, president of Portlight Inclusive Disaster Strategies, right now most planning occurs for people with disabilities and older adults, not with us. Moving forward, we need to ensure that there is a substantial leadership and participation of people with disabilities during emergency planning. And that's really what our focus has been, our work has been. So I just want to go through some of the recommendations that we have through our work in our office. Some of the things that emergency planners need to consider is evacuation and training procedures that include people with physical, sensory, or intellectual disabilities, or who are autistic, or experience anxiety or other mental health concerns. Accessible transportation to evacuate older persons and people with disabilities. We have met with New Jersey Transit and suggested that their Access Link service, the mandated ADA transportation service for people with disabilities, that service be available during a disaster. We have general population shelters are ready to accommodate people with disabilities and provide those services for people with disabilities that allow them to get those services in their shelter rather than going into a segregated, more costly shelter. Special needs shelter is not something that we would advocate for. And that the other thing that we recommend is that planners utilize independent living centers like ours. We provide lots of different services. We are in touch with our constituents. We could provide counseling services. We can help alleviate social isolation. We can help fill out paperwork FEMA requires. We can set up hotlines. So we could be a resource. We also want to increase the number of accessible emergency shelters. Accessible meaning accessible bathrooms, staffed by trained personnel, staffed by personal assistants. Accessible meals, a lot of MREs are not accessible for people with disabilities. Accessible communications, the list goes on.
Please finalize.
And really, we have other recommendations that are in my testimony, but I think there needs to be a close working relationship with the American Red Cross and FEMA and other organizations involved with disaster, disaster preparation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we'll recognize Dr. Flint to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Payne, it's an honor to appear before you today at this important meeting to speak about the impact of disasters on children. As noted, Lawrence Flint, I'm certified, board-certified pediatrician working in hospital in New Jersey, both in general pediatrics and disaster medicine, and have served as the state representative to the American Academy of Pediatrics Disaster Preparedness Committee since 2016. Children make up 25% of the U.S. population and have unique medical and psychological needs. Although they fall under the umbrella category of quote-unquote vulnerable populations, they deserve attention that is customized to meet their specific needs. By considering which groups are at increased risk in a specific disaster, including those with disabilities, chronic illnesses, or who are economically or socially disadvantaged, advanced planning benefits all children. Children differ from adults in their physiology, behavior, emotional and developmental capacities, in their responses to traumatic events, and they're dependent on others for the basic physical and emotional needs. They are more susceptible to physical, biological, chemical hazards, and are at an increased risk of developmental problems as well. Children often lack the cognitive ability to flee from disaster or to comprehend risk. Infants and young children cannot care for themselves and require access to age-appropriate foods, including human milk or infant formula, as well as assistance in feeding, hygiene, and dressing. Security is a high priority as children are much more susceptible to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in the wake of disasters, particularly when they're separated from their families. Disasters not only put more stress on individuals caring for their children, but they also bring out criminal opportunists who use the cover of a disaster to prey on the most vulnerable, including our children. After a disaster, children and their families are likely to experience a host of negative mental reactions, including stress, depression, anxiety, PTSD, behavioral regression, physical symptoms, and the worsening of pre-existing conditions. Children are among those most at risk for psychological trauma and behavioral difficulties after a disaster. Research has repeatedly confirmed that psychologically traumatic events in childhood can have significant lifelong effects, such as increases in chronic disease and poor coping abilities. Children's limited ability to understand the nature of the disaster can also lead to stress, fear, anxiety, and an inability to cope, as well as an exaggerated response to media exposure. This is far worsened in the age of social media. It is important then to have established trusted sources of information for families and communities. Pediatricians and other health professionals can help fill those roles. Partnering in advance of disasters is essential to optimizing community mental health. Psychological recovery is a multi-tiered process that begins with providing for the basic physical needs, then the provision of psychological first aid, and later, more comprehensive counseling and mental health resources to support children and their communities. Attention to the needs of children in disasters encompasses a continuum of pre-disaster preparation, delivery of care and services during a disaster, and follow-up services in the disaster recovery period. Appropriate medical equipment, supplies, and medications specific to children of various ages and sizes should be readily available, as should medical and mental health providers with some degree of training in disaster-related concepts. Disaster preparation extends to all places that work with children, including schools, shelters, daycares, camps, hospitals, and medical offices. In the daytime, children are often separated from their caregivers, and processes for prompt family reunification are a critical component, as children clearly do best when with their families. Post-disaster care and assistance is necessary to the effective resilience of children and their communities. The American Academy of Pediatrics have been at the forefront of addressing the needs of children in disasters through partnering with and advising state, local, and federal agencies, and by providing numerous resources to inform and educate professionals, parents, children, and administrators on topics including natural disasters, pandemics, economic emergencies, and terror events. The Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council has more than 80 contacts, including myself, in all AAP state chapters. Some of the many collaborative efforts with federal agencies include the HHS Office of Assistant Secretary of Preparedness Response, which is requiring pediatric annexes and is offering funding for pediatric centers of excellence, and the CDC, which has established its Children's Preparedness Unit. We believe that continuing to build pediatric capacity within all areas of government and public health is crucial and can be facilitated by connecting with the American Academy of Pediatrics nationally and/or through its local chapters. Increased inclusion of pediatric practitioners and groups involved in disaster field care, such as disaster medical assistant teams on the federal level or state urban search and rescue teams, would enable directly meeting the needs of children. Finally, working towards centralized coordination and implementation of programs can help maximize delivery of care and standardizing of protocols and procedures on state and federal levels. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this critical topic, and thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you for your testimony, and now I recognize myself for questioning. Mr. Coppish, can you discuss your collaboration relationship with the state and FEMA, and do you see room for improvement, or do you believe this is a model for other states?
Yes. We've collaborated with FEMA over the last several years. We work with the FEMA office, Jim Fleming, who is the integration specialist there, He helped, we worked with him to set up the first CAG Core Advisory Group, which is really an effort of emergency planners and people with disabilities coming together to really work on emergency planning for the next disaster. And the idea is to include people with disabilities in the planning process. So FEMA, we work closely with FEMA on this effort. We've worked with the Red Cross. We've worked with the Office on Emergency Preparedness. I mentioned in my testimony about 2 shelter simulations that we did, and those could not have been done without the work of the Office of Emergency Management in the counties that we had those mock exercises in. So could we do more? There was a lot of work that we could be doing to educate, especially OEM, about the accommodations and the needs of people with disabilities in a shelter and in a disaster in general. But the work is still going on, and we are happy that we have formed partnerships with these organizations, but there's always work that needs to be done as far as information sharing, as far as learning about, people with disabilities and what accommodations they need during these disasters and even before disasters.
Thank you. Dr. Flint, we're increasingly seeing children exhibiting signs of mental health distress after disasters. In Florida, after Hurricane Michael, Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, and elsewhere, children continue to suffer long after the storm passes. Research has also found that after Sandy, children with damage to their homes were over 4 times as likely to be sad or depressed, and over twice as likely to have problems sleeping compared to children from homes with no damage. What do you think the federal government can do better to alleviate this distress?
Great, thank you. So clearly the mental health component in children's disasters is a big one, and it's one of the long-term issues that needs to be addressed to be able to have these kids get back into doing their normal routines. As with anything in disaster planning, it's the idea of that multi-tiered process of both planning and preparedness, disaster response, and then post-disaster recovery. So the mental health aspects would go across that spectrum as well. So in terms of the planning process, where we could use help, is identifying the people in the areas that would have particular special needs, whether that be non-English speaking or communities with different cultural. So those identification of needs, identification of providers and training of those providers. And also one of the things that personally I think is great is bringing in training on disaster preparedness to kids themselves. So things like the Teen Cert program, where children are actually brought into or trained in disaster response. I think that's not only enriching the communities, but also empowering those kids as well. And ultimately, having that ability is going to make them more resilient. And then in terms of the disaster response itself, as I mentioned in my testimony, the first part is providing the basic needs. No amount of counseling or mental health care is going to replace the security that's brought about by providing families with safety, shelter, food, and other basic physical needs that they need. Secondary to that is to have providers that are trained in psychological first aid, and that's the idea that these are the first people that are going to be addressing mental health concerns in a disaster situation. So those folks are going to give people access to resources. They're going to give them some reassurance. They're going to give them information on the disaster itself so that they have a little more to work with then. And then finally, in the post-disaster phase, is going to be where the long-term counseling, so providing mental health services across the spectrum, which can, as noted, go on for a long ways. So I think that's where, you know, the help can be. Any of those areas where you can give assistance is gonna impact that.
So it would appear that, and I could be wrong, that it would be very difficult to be prepared for the psychological or the mental aspects of the trauma until the trauma happens. There is no real way to, you know, prepare young people like, you know, there's a storm coming.
I think that's a fair statement, but I also think that, you know, the idea of getting more, you know, and as disasters are seeming to become, you know, more, happening more and more, you know, bringing the education to kids just so that at least that way they have an understanding, an idea, and like I said, even disaster preparedness training. I think the idea of personal responsibility and training in disasters is a really good one. And I think, like I said, I think bringing that into the community is a very empowering thing. And I think that certainly helps with mental resilience.
Making sure that once the disaster does happen, that, you know, in those first responders, there are people that can talk to the mental health aspect.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, you know, a week into it, but be on the scene and the initial response to it would be helpful.
And certainly those with pediatric training as well. Just one more point, you know, I think with kids especially, the most important thing is that return to structure. So getting basic services, including schools, up and running again, even though it's not going to be, you know, the old normal, at least it's a new normal, and it's going to put them back in that structure, and that goes a long way to mental resiliency.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. This is to both of you. You have, you know, shared so much with the subcommittee today, and I really appreciate you being here. Are there ways that Congress can be more helpful to you and your organization? Mr. Coppers.
Sure. I think we talked a lot about funding and, you know, money and how I think is the same for independent living centers. When I said we're nonprofit, we're very nonprofit. So we struggle with, we're asked to do more for little dollars. So we would love to do more with emergency preparedness if there's funding attached to it. We see a lot with, talk about mental health services. We see it during Superstorm Sandy. It's hard for me to say, but we saw a lot of people with adults with mental health really really being affected by the storm, not knowing where to go, not trusting who to go to, really are in need of counseling. And the organizations that were set up to provide counseling, we were told were only there for people affected by the storm, and we're not set up to help people who had mental health concerns before the storm. So that's just one area where our center, at least, has been working more on, and we could use more training, we could use more funding, we could use more resources to help those individuals. And a lot of the people that we work with mental health concerns have their primary concern may be a physical disability or a cognitive disability. And so we're working with them on that, but also the mental health may be a secondary. But we work with all disabilities, and when you say, how can Congress help, we could use more money.
Okay, Thank you. Dr. Flint?
No, I would echo many of the sentiments that Mr. Coffers has said, just substitute children in there. And I think just the idea of partnering with pediatric services, pediatric organizations, and we've done a lot, collectively to do that. Certainly any legislation that's disaster-related, just to keep in mind the pediatric component and to bring in those that can speak to that to help with that legislation, I think goes a long way.
Thank you. And we're seeing climate change increase the frequency and severity of these natural disasters. We're having 100-year climate issues every 5 years now. And, the vulnerable and underserved often suffer those effects disproportionately. What steps need to be taken so underserved populations aren't disproportionately affected? Mr. Coppers?
I think some of the recommendations that I went through briefly in my testimony would help alleviate the vulnerable populations being affected disproportionately. But I think the key is any emergency planning should include people with disabilities. That's a must. It has to be done. What better resource in organizing emergency preparedness for people with disabilities than people with disabilities themselves? And I want to address something that was said prior about registering for FEMA services or other services online. A lot of the people that we work with don't have access to the internet, cannot afford it. There's a great digital divide. So there needs to be a way to get information to those individuals who are not connected. We need to not forget about the old school of communicating with people. So that's something that is important. Other ways, accessible formats for people who are hearing impaired or visually impaired. A lot of people just are not getting information, and it's because it's not in an accessible format. And I have a statistic here about the number of fatalities during Superstorm Sandy, 285 fatalities, and according to the EPA, 50% of those were people who were elderly or people with disabilities. Now, I don't know how many of that included people who just did not know where to go for resources or go for help, but I can probably guess that there's a lot of people who just weren't aware, and maybe the information was not accessible to them. So that's really important. Equal access to emergency registrations operated by state, federal, and nonprofit emergency providers. Again, alternate format. So different ways rather than the printed way, rather than the digital way. Health maintenance items and accessible technology, that's important for people, especially those who use mobility, who have mobility concerns. They need to stay with them during a disaster. A lot of times we've heard about wheelchairs being separated from people or communication boards being separated from people during a disaster. Deploying personal assistance to help individuals during a disaster. So I know the state has done that in the past, but there needs to be a better effort. People rely on others for assistance, walking, bathing, eating, getting around, and that's really important to have those available during a disaster, and especially in a shelter.
Thank you. Dr. Flynn?
Yeah, unfortunately, vulnerable populations, including underserved, do bear the brunt of a lot of these disasters, just simply because the resources, aren't there for them to be able to recover with that. I would say for me, three things would be important to increasing the services there. I think first, it's identifying the barriers to access within those communities and addressing them. I would also say that, prioritizing them in disaster response simply because they are going to have long-term effects that are going to go beyond other communities who may have greater capacity for resilience. And then third, I would say that when we have new disaster planning procedures, I would prioritize them in terms of rolling them out in those communities. Certainly, the responses are going to be more difficult in those communities, and I think overall we're going to gain a lot more information and education about rolling out different processes and procedures by going to those communities first and identifying the major problems that are there.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you being here and providing testimony, which on this subcommittee and in Homeland Security, we really use this testimony in order to formulate better practices by FEMA and different organizations, and also creating legislation that would be helpful in these areas. So thank you. I want to thank you for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions, which was me. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days without objection. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.